Good afternoon. Today is the fourth in a series of 5 webinar presentations in Vermont Public Utility Commission case number 21-3883-Rule, which the Commission opened to develop a rule for energy storage facilities as directed by the legislature in Act 54 of the 2021 legislative session. The Commission is hosting this 5-part webinar series in conjunction with the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Electricity Energy Storage Program and Sandia National Laboratories. We are conducting this webinar series remotely using the Teams platform. We will be recording these presentations and making them available to the public as soon as we can post them. We will provide information on how to access the recordings as soon as possible. If you do experience technical difficulties today, I encourage you to try and reconnect to the platform. Given the large number of attendees, we will not be able to halt the presentations for any one person that is experiencing difficulty with their connection. In the event someone is unable to reconnect, they will have access to the recordings of each session once they are posted. Please keep your cameras and microphones off during the presentation to help conserve bandwidth and screen real estate. A quick note about the posting of presentations. The recordings, the video and audio recordings of webinars 1, 2, and 3 are now available using the Commission's electronic case management system, EPUC. If you go to EPUC and search for the case number 21-3883-Rule, and select the tab for Commission issued documents, you will see for each of those first 3 webinars, documents entitled memo with link to the recording for the webinar, whether it's 1, 2, or 3. And if you click on that document, it will open up and it will give you a link to the webinar. Under the tab for all other documents, you will find the slide decks that are being used. We do not have all of the slide decks that have been used to date published. We are publishing them as quickly as possible, but I believe 5 or 6 slide decks are available at this time. We are conducting this webinar. Oh, I'm sorry. I got to the very end there. Please keep your cameras and microphones off during the presentation to help conserve bandwidth and screen real estate. An additional note about our use of the Teams platform. During webinar 3, we found an account registered to an artificial intelligence bot that was listening in. It was removed from the meeting. We will continue to monitor registrations and attendance for the use of bots or artificial intelligence, and we will remove them as we find them for cybersecurity purposes. So we appreciate your understanding. My name is John Cotter. I'm a staff attorney and deputy general counsel at the Vermont Public Utility Commission. I am joined today by Mary Jo Kralewski, utilities analyst, and Dominic Gotti, Department of Energy Clean Energy Innovator Fellow. Before we get started, I would once again like to thank, on behalf of the entire Commission, our colleagues at Sandia National Laboratories that have been working with us to make these presentations possible. Today's presentations will start with some examples of lessons learned from actual projects in diverse regions and the challenges they have presented. We will then move to a discussion of operational and policy issues associated with aggregated energy storage facilities, as they are expected to increasingly support grid operations going forward. If we have time at the end today, we will also preview next week's roundtable discussion on efforts by other New England states to develop regulations governing storage facilities. On that note, for next week, we did issue an order a little over a week ago, I believe, encouraging folks to submit questions that they may have for next week's roundtable discussion by filing them in EPUC. If you do have questions and you have yet to file them, please try to get them to us by the close of business tomorrow. That way you can make sure that specific questions that you have will get addressed next week. Your presenters today will be Mr. Waylon Clark, Mr. Will McNamara, and Mr. Ted Coe. I'll now give a brief summary of their backgrounds. Mr. Clark is a principal staff member for Sandia National Laboratories Energy Storage Program as a research and development electrical engineer in the Energy Storage Technologies and Systems Department. He currently leads the Energy Storage Demonstration Project Team with installations ranging from coastal and interior Alaska to the central mountainous regions of Puerto Rico. Mr. Clark has spent over 15 years working in the field of electrical engineering, project management, and technical leadership. His expertise includes medium voltage substations, medium and low voltage distribution systems, process controls, battery energy storage systems, and data analytics. Mr. Clark has been at Sandia National Laboratories for almost 10 years in a variety of technical and leadership roles. Mr. McNamara serves as Grid Energy Storage Policy Analyst for Sandia National Laboratories, with a focus on energy storage policy development at the federal and state levels. He has spent his entire 30-year career in the energy and utilities industry with a concentration on regulatory and legislative policy. He has served as a lobbyist in California and has represented major utilities across the U.S. in numerous jurisdictions in proceedings pertaining to integrated resource planning, procurement, cost recovery, rate design, and the development of policymaking best practices. Mr. McNamara's areas of subject matter expertise, in addition to energy storage policy, include distributed energy resources, AMI smart grid, renewables, and competitive retail markets. And Mr. Coe is a leading expert on public policy for electricity systems and the deployment of distributed energy resources. He leads the Energy Policy Design Institute, which is currently helping the Maryland Public Service Commission design their program to achieve a 3 gigawatt energy storage deployment target. Previously, Mr. Coe led global policy engagement for STEM Inc., an early pioneer in battery storage and the first company to build and operate a fully commercial storage virtual power plant in the country. With degrees and senior level experience in software and business administration, Mr. Coe is uniquely helpful in creating strategies and roadmaps for the reliable, resilient, clean energy grid of the future. We will have approximately 10 minutes for questions and answers at the end of each presentation. If we do get more questions than time allows, we will be prioritizing questions from those who have been actively participating in the rulemaking process in case number 21-3883-rule. If you do have a question, please enter it into the chat function and make sure to type in your name and your affiliation before you begin typing your question. Please understand this is not an opportunity to express opinions or offer comments. Rather, it is an opportunity to ask clarifying questions in response to the materials you hear today. We will be establishing a schedule for moving the rulemaking process forward after we conclude the webinar series, and there will be opportunities at that time for providing comments and recommendations on what the rule should include. Of course, you are always welcome to file public comments into the case using EPUC at any time. With that said, I will hand things over to Waylon Clark for our first presentation. Mr. Clark.
Dr. Zook, did you want to say something?
Yeah. No, I'll skip it since I've been relegated to listener.
Okay, well, let me get my slides shared and I'll get going. Dylan, will you let me know if, or Dr. Drick, can you everyone see my slides?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Well, I will go off camera to save some bandwidth. I'll come back on for a Q&A if necessary. But again, good morning, everyone. My name is Waylon Clark. Well, technically morning in New Mexico, probably afternoon for most of you. So my name is Waylon Clark, and I do lead Sandia's Energy Storage Demonstrations Projects team. And what that has afforded me to do is learn an awful lot about what goes right and what goes wrong in deployment of energy storage systems. But first, what I would like to do is talk a little bit about what we do as a team here and a little bit about the breadth of our projects so that you can understand where our learning comes from. So what does the energy storage demonstration do at Sandia? Well, we support communities, state energy offices, utilities, academia, and the overall energy storage industry to demonstrate and validate the use of resilient and secure energy storage systems on and off the grid through our demonstration projects. Our work with innovative demonstration projects helps advance the DOE's goal of facilitating decarbonization of the grid by improving public acceptance and understanding of energy storage systems and serving communities by enabling equitable clean energy access. And I'll key in on these topics again as I talk about specific deployments that match those topics. And this first one is we support academia, and not just in the traditional sense of a national lab of working with university colleagues and hosting and hiring interns and postdocs, but literally we support academia with deployed energy storage systems like this project here, which is located at the Santa Fe Community College in Santa Fe, New Mexico. This project is a learning microgrid for students, but it also supports an operational aquaponics greenhouse. This greenhouse is the fish and the vegetable sort of cycle ecosystem. And we're told that if these pumps go off for even more than a minute, the fish start to die. And an interesting note about this particular greenhouse is during the pandemic, they actually provided food and fresh vegetables to the community throughout the pandemic, as there were no students or anyone at the school, and so they kept growing lettuce and other stuff and harvesting the fish and providing food for the community all throughout the pandemic. So it's a very important community asset and an important project to us as well. This particular installation is us supporting utilities. This is the Cordova Electric Cooperative's first and only battery so far in Cordova, Alaska, a remote and coastal fishing village. And it's not our only Alaska project, as we have another being installed in St. Mary's Village, Alaska. And Alaska is unique in providing a wide breadth of learnings when installing an energy storage system. It's from the application of the distributed energy source that charges the best. For example, Cordova utilizes run-of-the-river hydroelectric. The St. Mary's, Alaska project is predominantly wind-driven generation with, of course, in Alaska, there's a lot of diesel fuel generators that power all the different towns' microgrids, which is something we're actively trying with our demonstration projects to demonstrate how battery systems can reduce the reliance on diesel fuel. We support communities, our demonstration projects do. This is an innovative demonstration project. And when I say innovative, what I mean by that is there are an awful lot of other technologies out there besides lithium ion. Lithium ion at a point in time was innovative, but it's a commercial product now. There are other chemistries and other types of energy storage systems that are going through that same sort of growth process. And we help that growth process by deploying systems like this one, which is a rechargeable zinc manganese dioxide battery system, to an off-grid home on the Navajo reservation. This solar plus storage off-grid system that you see here supports the home load to an individual that has no grid access. So this is a critical service in learning and figuring out other technologies besides the lithium ion that can survive perhaps sometimes better in harsh conditions like the Arizona desert. Our demonstrations support resilience. This project here is in Red Feather Lakes, Colorado. One of the many and several wildfires in this area in Colorado burnt down the distribution line, the single distribution line that fed this and other neighboring towns. What this resulted in is that it forced the volunteer fire departments, which make up the vast majority of first responders in smaller communities, to operate out of stations that were much further away from their own towns. So this BEST demonstration project supports a community microgrid. And one of the things you might be able to see in the background is this is the community library with solar on it. Here, of course, is energy storage system. The building directly behind is the volunteer fire department station. So, if in another wildfire event, the volunteer fire department would be able to operate out of this fire station and out of their own community and better able to respond to the community needs by having this microgrid set up. So we do projects, as that was a small example of, all over the country, as mentioned in my bio, from Alaska to Puerto Rico. And we learn something different from every unique environment and application we're in. We have anywhere from 12 to 14 ongoing projects at any time. And we do this year over year in order to advance some of those goals that I mentioned in the first slide. So to get to the meat of what I'm here to talk about, which is lessons learned or takeaways or issues, I'm going to have 5 different projects to discuss that all have had some unique challenge in either the siting, the actual installation and deployment, or even the decommissioning of the battery energy storage system. So on this slide here, this first project I'm going to talk about, you can see that it's in Albuquerque, New Mexico, my backyard. It was with Albuquerque Public Schools, which is one of the states and I believe the country's largest school district, just by how many students and schools they have within this district. This school, where it's located, serves a community of students that are predominantly English as second language learners, and the vast majority qualify for free school lunch program. This school actually hosts an on-site community healthcare clinic, and their intent is to turn this in the future to use this as a resilience hub in the case of any sort of grid outages. Predominantly, though, to start with, because this is one of the largest schools in the district, they wanted to utilize this energy storage system to reduce their demand charges, which were the highest out of all the schools in the district. This is a Tesla Megapack lithium-ion battery, 721 kilowatt 4-hour battery energy storage, and they also installed 850 kilowatts of rooftop PV. I can just imagine, even though I can't see it, Dr. Juk kind of snickering about this, because it was well over a year ago now, that he stood right there in front of that the gates of that energy storage system, and we stretched a ribbon across it and cut the ribbon and celebrated the completion of this energy storage project. However, to date, this energy storage system has not been turned on or operated for 1 second. And the reason is because of interconnection challenges and process delays. This interconnection request was submitted in September of 2021, and the request part was completed in April of 2023, 1.5 years. During that process, that long process, the utility also identified the need to upgrade some of the protection systems. So although, the interconnection process was reviewed and everyone's, said, okay, this is good, the battery can operate here, but we need to install some equipment, and that'll take another 6 to 8 months. So this energy storage system will not be online, is not anticipated to be online until, this coming month of this year. Something ironic about this project, I think ironic based on pictures I see of Tesla drivers, is the battery sat there for so long that Tesla actually contacted the school and said, hey guys, your battery is actually degrading and getting, into a very low state of charge. So the school had to actually bring in a diesel generator to charge the batteries because it had been sitting so long. So these interconnection challenges are something that you may have already heard about in some of these presentations, but if you have not, I can guarantee you that it exists in Vermont and it exists everywhere else. And so this in particular interconnection issues is something that really needs to be addressed. Second project, Picos Pueblo in northern New Mexico. This pueblo is located in the San Juan Mountains of northern New Mexico, and due to their remote location, they experience more often and frequent power outages than other folks do. The utility, the electrical co-op that serves this region has to travel long distances to fix the equipment, so the durations of the outages are also longer. So what the Pueblo wants to do is, and what they are doing currently, is they're installing a whole lot of solar. And to go with the solar, they'd like to install a battery energy storage system that can create a community microgrid and power homes and other Pueblo and tribal offices when the power goes out. A challenge is, I wouldn't necessarily say, is the interconnection process, but it does have to do with the utility and connecting or disconnecting from the grid during the outage. And this process is what they want to do is be able to utilize the electrical co-op's distribution lines during a grid outage. And really, in general, that is a broad no-no, because it poses a safety hazard to utility workers who, during a broad grid outage may not realize that some of their utility lines could be energized. However, on the flip side of that, with the expected growth in energy storage, non-conventional thinking and maybe some rule changes would need to be enacted to allow for a wider application of community-sized microgrids that utilize existing utility infrastructure in order to keep power on to communities or critical infrastructure during a normal grid outage. So there's ongoing discussions with the utility about this particular issue in this particular project. As mentioned, we work in U.S. territories such as Puerto Rico. We have an ongoing project with the municipality of Villalba. They're located in the central mountainous region of Puerto Rico. And why I describe that exactly like that is, and define it that way, is because due to its location and the fact that it's in a mountainous part of Puerto Rico, what ends up happening, during some of the major events that everyone's heard about in Puerto Rico, like Hurricane Maria, it's this area of the island that is the last to get their power restored. It's remote. It's sometimes hard to access the distribution and transmission lines that are torn out. So during Hurricane Maria, I think some of the last folks at almost a year later were in this region that were to get their power restored. So what this particular municipality wants to do is create a local resilience hub using energy storage plus solar at a local theater building. It currently serves as a backup emergency operations center because it does have an operating diesel fuel generator. The challenge here, and the challenge I think with a lot of smaller communities, is that much larger projects often take priority over smaller projects. And so when you're working with small communities, tribes, I mean, one thing everyone can agree to is that resources is a battle that everyone faces. Even in a large organization, people end up wearing multiple hats. But the smaller the community, oftentimes the greater the need, but also the less resources they have to dedicate towards working on a project. And so this can draw out project times and completion times for getting all of the necessary steps done in a project that takes active collaboration and concurrence a lot of times with the local community and whoever that designated person is. So something to consider, when energy storage is being deployed in any remote region, whether it's in a U.S. territory or a U.S. state, that the availability of people resources is something that definitely needs to be considered and is happening in Villalba. The bigger project that is taking up a lot of their focus is, I imagine this is small for you guys to see, but there's 5 municipalities that formed a consortium and they're in red. And what they want to do is create a municipality-sized microgrid for each of those 5 that all interconnect to each other, a very massive undertaking. But they're serious about it. And so that eats up a lot of their people resources. And so a smaller nano grid or microgrid for one building, doesn't exactly, isn't exactly given priority. This next project is on Ellsworth Air Force Base near Rapid City, South Dakota. It's a partnership with the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association through their Rural Energy Storage Deployment Program. And it's a partnership with the local Rural Electrical Association, Sandia, PNNL, and of course the Air Force Base. That will be an issue that we talk about coming up, is how many people are involved. But one of the major issues here is codes and standards and regulations, CSRs. The location that I'm showing here, where the actual pad is being poured and is complete and ready for the energy storage system, is not the original location this project selected. There was a change in what the DoD calls its Unified Facilities Criteria, and they have an energy storage section in there. And one of it states that an energy storage system cannot be located within 100 feet of a building. Well, the original location was at a building and there was no open space within 100 feet of that building. So we had to pick an entirely different location for this energy storage system. And this can happen. Codes and standards change, and we deal with it a lot every 3 years for an FPA and other codes and standards. When the DoD does it, of course, it's not voluntary or doesn't usually come with a grace period. They say, this is what you're going to do now, and that's the way it is. Another unique aspect of this project and something really to be considered in any rulemaking process is, what are the codes and standards and regulations that you're going to hold vendors to? And I believe NFP 855, the most recent edition, 2023, is one of the most important documents concerning energy storage that's out there now. It incorporates all of the learnings and everything that's been known so far about battery fires and how to mitigate or prevent them. And the vendor we're working with is really going through a lot of hoops to design their energy storage system so it meets the requirements of NFP 855's explosion mitigation sections. Of course, as I mentioned, the more entities you have involved, national labs, the DOE, the DOD, the FFA, because it's a radar tower that you see in the pictures, the NRECA, the WREA, that introduces its own challenges, but not necessarily something that can't be overcome. So the previous 4 projects all had some issues that happened when we were installing the battery energy storage system. And there isn't a whole lot of information out there about what to do at the end of system life or decommissioning. Slowly, a body of knowledge is being built up around that as energy storage systems start to age out. But there's not a lot right now. Of course, Sandia has a few under our belt already, and they happen to be non-lithium ion technologies, actually. So Sandia was involved with deploying several flow battery systems, all of which failed in one manner or another. Some of them failed while the company was in business, and at least 2 of them failed after the company went bankrupt. And so you could imagine that kind of challenge when you have to decommission an energy storage system and there is nobody to turn to. There's no vendor to talk to about, what do we do now? What do we take apart first? How do we recycle this hydrochloric and sulfuric vanadium metal acid? So this has been a big challenge for us, because we're working with our partners at the Natural Energy Laboratory of Hawaii Authority that has a system, and the system that's on Sandia's own property here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, on the Air Force Base in which we reside, suffered a catastrophic leak, and it's the bottom picture where that mixed acid sprayed out through the vents and onto the ground. So we had two systems that we had to decommission and no one to tell us how to do it. So, that in itself poses a lot of challenges. And one of the biggest lessons learned from our involvement in these failed systems with no company to turn to is, again, NFP 855 requires a commissioning and decommissioning plan be delivered at the time the system is installed. So even if the company were to go out of business, if you had a decommissioning plan in hand, this could at least provide the start of how you would decommission the system. You would still need to reach out to some SMEs and get some other expertise in hand if needed, but at least you'd have a document to work off of. So decommissioning and end of life considerations are something that I don't think are taken into consideration. One of the reasons why is, you'll notice how big the team is when you're installing an energy storage system. You have all kinds of stakeholders and interested parties. After the container is on the concrete pad and the ribbon is cut, there's no one left but the system owner. That's the only person left. Everyone's on to bigger and better things, other projects. And so when the end of life comes for these energy storage systems, there's only the system owner to figure out how to do this. And so a lot more consideration and due diligence needs to be placed on decommissioning and end of life, in my opinion, based on what we've seen so far. So that's a quick rundown. Of course, I want to thank Dr. Juk again. He pays us to learn all these things the hard way so that we can share some of this with you guys. I'd be glad to answer some questions about any of our projects or things that we've learned in general, if anyone has any. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Waylon. Yeah, really interesting stuff, I have to say. I do got one question here in the chat for you so far from our friend Charlie Vartanian from IEEE. Asked, it's a little bit long, so bear with me.
Yeah.
Have your project partners budgeted adequately for project soft costs, including environmental permitting, interconnection, and local fire safety sign-offs? I'm assuming these soft costs could be a significant portion of full turnkey costs for smaller, under 1 megawatt, 1 megawatt hour BESS projects, and possible area where retail regulation can streamline and limit soft cost amount and risk.
So yes and no, Charlie. You sometimes you can't budget for the unknowns. For example, in the APS project, it wasn't known how much the utility would come back with and say, we have all these upgrades we need to make, and you're on the hook, the system owner, APS, you're on the hook for a part of these costs. Obviously, you want to get the interconnection request in as early as possible, which we did. But when it lasts a year and a half, you've already signed the contract with the vendor, you're moving ahead with the project, and you get hit with an extra bill for some of these things. So I think in some regards, you try and plan for the soft costs as best you can, but there's always going to be one-offs or something that you didn't expect. I would say one of the things that is more predominant that we're seeing now is RFPs aren't including the right kind of language because different states are on different code years for the International Fire Code or the NFPA 1, whichever fire code your state uses. They're on different versions in different years, and it's vitally important that safety of energy storage systems becomes more of a priority than it is. And in order for a system to be safe, it costs money. And that requirement has to be there. It has to say from the state level or whoever the entity is that determines those, You have to wire these standards, or you can get an energy storage system that isn't as safe as it could be.
Great. Looks like we got another question from Anthony Roisman from the Vermont PUC, who asks, has enacting federal legislation to preempt the local red tape that is interfering with implementation of these projects been considered?
I don't know about legislation to speak to that, but I do know that the DOE has an effort underway to look at and hopefully help address, along with other entities, federal entities, the interconnection queue, because it's so prevalent and it's across all states, and it varies so wildly. It swings from, you know, city, county, there's just such a variance in interconnection that I know the DOE is looking at that, but as far as enacting something that says, your queue can't be longer than 4 months or something like that, I haven't seen or heard of. Or in any other realm, including safety, because as I mentioned, the International Fire Code, or the NFPA 1, is adopted on a state by state level, and even a municipality um, level. Sometimes they'll adopt different pieces. So it's really a patchwork across the US of, what you have to adhere to and who's driving what. And thanks, Charlie. I see you put a link in there, because that is definitely the top of DOE's mind, especially when there's all this money out there to enact clean energy. If everything's backed up in an interconnection queue, then we're not going to meet our goals.
Great, fantastic. Looks like that's all the questions we have in the chat. Again, thank you so much, Waylon, for
Yeah,
the
great. Thanks
wonderful
for
talk
having
and
me.
presentation. Of course.
Appreciate it.
All right. I'm going to transition then to Will McNamara. Will, there you are. Hey. And the floor is yours. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you, Dylan. Hello, everyone. It's good to be back with you today. Going to pull up my presentation here. And Dylan, let me know if you can see that okay.
Looks good.
Okay, thank you. I will stay on camera unless we have any connection issues, but so far so good. So again, hi everyone, Will McNamara with Sandia. Great to be with you again. I am presenting for the second time in this series. And if you were here for the first time that I presented, I think this is a nice bookend to what I talked about before, which was a number of policy issues, of course, specific to energy storage. But I spent a lot of time talking about ISO New England, what's happening with Order 2222 and its compliance filing to FERC. So again, I think this dovetails very nicely, because now for the duration of this workshop, we're pivoting to talk about aggregated distributed storage. So I think this works very nicely, and it's a good foundation for the speaker who will come after me, Ted Coe. So what I'd like to cover today is just to tee up this discussion with some relevant terms, have a discussion around how aggregated distributed energy resources participate in electricity markets, talk a little bit about aggregation models that are emerging. I'm going to give you some state examples of policies, some high-level thoughts around the state regulatory role and how policymakers can take steps to build frameworks for DERS aggregation. And then, of course, we'll close out with some Q&A. I will start out by saying that this is very much an emerging topic from a policy perspective as we continue this massive transformation from centralized generation to heavier reliance on distributed resources. We're just really starting this process in terms of building out policy frameworks. So, keep that in mind that this is definitely an emerging topic, but we do have some groundwork that we're able to pull from. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has defined distributed energy resources. And I think this provides a good entry point. So the way that FERC has defined it is any resource that's located on the distribution system, any subsystem thereof, or a behind the customer meter. These resources may include, but are not limited to, resources that are in front of and behind the customer meter, electric storage resources, which is, of course, a primary interest to us here, intermittent generation, distributed generation, demand response, energy efficiency, thermal storage, electric vehicles, and their supply equipment. So as you can see, this covers a very wide net of potential resources that could be considered distributed energy resources. It includes smart thermostats, smart water heaters, electric vehicle chargers, and of course, behind the meter batteries, which is really where I am focused with my presentation here today. But I think it's also important to note that we also have to give some consideration to wind farms, combined heat and power units, water heating units, pool pumps. Really, the end is the scope is pretty endless. And when it comes to a state regulatory policy perspective, these are all technologies that would potentially fall within the domain of a state regulatory commission. Now, the other relevant term to this discussion is what we would call a DERS aggregator. And this is an entity that aggregates one or more distributed energy resources for the participation in either a capacity market, an energy market, or an ancillary services market. Now, this is typically overseen from a federal level through FERC and based on the rules that are coming out of the regional transmission organizations, also known as independent system operators. And so I would again refer you back to the presentation that I delivered several weeks back. It is available, the recording, so you can get that context of the role of the RTOs and ISOs. But also a key term here is what we are calling virtual power plants. And these are the aggregations of the distributed energy resources. And they can contribute to the grid support through a number of services, rather equivalent to a traditional power plant. So again, we're seeing this migration away from reliance on centralized generation to heavier inclusion of distributed resources. Now, virtual power plants can include the participation of residential, commercial, and industrial customers, and they can include a variety of participation models. And so it's taking different shape and different forms depending on the market that we're talking about. But there are some common denominators when we talk about the value proposition of these VPPs. They have the potential to support resource adequacy. They certainly can help from a utilities perspective in driving down the CapEx costs of T&D infrastructure build out, helping utilities to avoid fuel costs. They certainly support reliability and resilience. They contribute to the overall goals of decarbonization and air pollution reduction because, again, we're not relying as heavily on the centralized fossil fuel generation that's been the legacy condition, helping utilities and policymakers for the T&D infrastructure constraints. Waylon touched a little bit on that from an interconnection standpoint, but as these aggregated distributed energy resources become more prevalent, it's a workaround in a sense to get through some of the congestion scenarios that exist both on the distribution and transmission grid. These resources can help communities. So if they are sited in particular areas that are challenged for one way or another, building out their own resources to work independently from the grid. So these resources have very substantial value, and that, of course, is why there is increasing emphasis being placed on them. Now, how aggregated DERs participate in an electricity market is very much dependent on the market that we're talking about. The variations of how they're going to contribute to grid support depends on the market status of a state, whether we're talking about a vertically integrated state versus a restructured market. In vertically integrated states, those are states in which retail competition has not been introduced. Utilities still have a very prominent role in owning generation assets, transmission assets, and distribution assets. So in those states, speaking generally, I would say that the growth of distributed energy resources may be less prominent because of the utilities' role and legacy investments in these large centralized facilities. But to the extent that they are developed, utilities in vertically integrated markets are going to have a much more primary role in managing how these distributed energy resources are used. And not surprisingly, they typically would be used more heavily on the distribution side that the utilities are concerned with. Now, on the restructured side, the virtual power plants can participate in wholesale markets, retail markets, or both. And in the restructured markets is where we start to see the influence of the ISOs and the RTOs becoming much more prevalent. These entities are responsible for ensuring that adequate resources exist within that particular region. The ISOs and the RTOs operate their wholesale markets with their own structures, can be inclusive of energy auctions. This involves the rules and the tariffs, and these are all subject to FERC approval, but directly relevant to this is FERC Order 2222, which is opening up wholesale market transactions to these aggregated distributed energy resources. So again, I refer you back to my previous presentation when I spoke of that in detail, and that is certainly emerging in the New England region with the filing that ISO New England has in place. So in retail markets, which are also a part of these restructured states, the virtual power plants can contract with a number of entities. They could contract directly with utilities, or they can operate completely independently and either supply services through the utility to enhance reliability and resilience, or in a competitive market, they may offer solutions directly to end-use customers. Now, of course, Vermont is a very unique state. It is the only state within New England that has opted not to restructure its electric industry, its electric market, through retail competition. So as we look at New England as a region, Vermont tends to reflect more of a vertically integrated scenario than what we see on the restructured market side. So that's important to keep in mind as we have this discussion. So how aggregated DERs participate in electricity markets, as I've said, there are different types of DERs and they have the potential to play different roles within a virtual power plant. Influencing factors that can impact this comes down to who owns the asset, where it's located, and the size of the asset. But as we are focused more on behind the meter batteries, The roles that they are typically playing is to provide backup power during grid outages. They are having an emerging role in ancillary services, particularly frequency regulation. And they are I would say, becoming more prominent in terms of the overall resilience and reliability profiles that we're seeing within utility integrated resource plans. In some instances, state regulators have required utilities to consider energy storage assets within their IRPs, and this can certainly include distributed energy resources as well. So what we are seeing in terms of aggregation models, and I suspect that Ted Coe, who will follow me, will delve into this a bit deeper. But there are three aggregation models that have started to emerge, really regardless of the market or the region. We have first the utility model, and that's the model in which the utility enrolls customer-owned distributed energy resources to provide grid services in exchange for some type of compensation. Now, that can vary between subsidies, direct payments, enrollment incentives. The utilities may operate the VPP in-house, or they may outsource this to a third-party provider. Examples of this are very close to Vermont with Green Mountain Power's battery VPP. And also another example is Duke Energy in the Carolinas with its managed electric vehicle charging VPP. The second model that has emerged is what we would call the retailer model. And this model includes manufacturers or retailers of the distributed energy resource who have sold it to a customer. They step in to take responsibility for the enrollment and management of these customers, and they sell the grid services for either retail or wholesale transactions for which the customer is then compensated. So an example of this would be DERS companies that have launched VPP platforms, including Tesla, Ford, General Motors. They're focused, of course, on the EV side. And then we have seen distributed solar and storage companies emerge, such as Sunrun and SunNova. And then finally, in the VPP platform model, this is the model in which a VPP platform company would enroll DERS aggregated, which may include different types of resources, different brands, all aggregated into a single portfolio. And in these instances, rather similar to the retailer model, the VPP will lead. I think we're getting some background noise there. If we could go on mute. The VPP platform model, the VPP platform company will sell the resources. It can be witnessed in both retail and wholesale markets. But in this scenario, the VPP platform company is the primary interface. An example of this would be Leap that has emerged into a number of markets. So I want to give you some examples of what's happening at the state policy level. And I'll start out by saying that policy that is related to aggregated DERS can take a number of different forms. Essentially, the policy is focused on creating the marketplace for distributed energy resources within that particular state. As I said earlier, we're really at the start of this process. So there's still just about a handful of states that we can point to that have really substantive policy specific to aggregated DERS. California, not surprisingly, stands out as a leader. They have several policy mechanisms that are relevant. There is a demand response auction mechanism in California that has created a marketplace for VPPs to sell demand response services back to the utilities. California has an emergency load reduction program. It is a customer program that pays electricity consumers for reducing their consumption during periods of electrical grid emergencies. Also very prominent in California is the subsidy program. This is known as Self-Generation Incentive Program. It provides rebates to customers for installing energy storage systems. So of course, this is driving the adoption of distributed storage as a solution. I would say finally, California is very noteworthy because of the ISO. It has, within its market rules, allowed for the full participation by VPPs in California's wholesale market. So consistent with the goals of Order 2222, the California ISO has jumped on board with that fully and has a very supportive policy for that. Other state examples that I would encourage you to look into further would be Hawaii, New York, and Texas. In Hawaii, there is a policy that a virtual power plant comprised of behind-the-meter battery energy storage systems and other DERs is being planned to help provide frequency support to the grid, including fast frequency response. This is a utility pilot program that is being overseen by the Hawaii Public Utility Commission. In New York, and this is coming out of the New York ISO, there is a utility retail level demand response program allowing dual participation for aggregated DERs, both in the New York ISO wholesale market and the retail demand response programs. So this is a policy that has come out of the ISO intended to encourage dual usage of these resources. New York ISO also has multiple load reduction programs that incorporate qualified behind-the-meter distributed energy resource aggregations. There is a program in New York that assigns a value to distributed energy resources, which is really important because a lot of the, I would say, policy challenge stems around what are these resources worth. So New York is already taking very important steps down that path. Also, New York has a non-wires alternative requirement that mandates utilities to solicit bids from eligible distributed energy resources for all load growth driven grid upgrades. So this is a scenario in which instead of building out more T&D infrastructure, utilities in this region are required to look at alternatives that come from aggregated DERs. In Texas, and of course, Texas is a very unique market, but the Emergency Response Service program in Texas procures capacity from distributed resources and loads. Texas has an aggregated load resource provision that is being expanded to include aggregated DERs. And there are commercial load programs that are run by Texas utilities that are compensating these resources as well. So again, I will underscore the fact that this is an emerging topic. There's not a whole lot of state policy that we have to pull from, but these are 4 state examples that are really on the leading edge of developing some best practices in this space. I would say to an audience of state regulators, again, the approach toward building these frameworks for aggregated DERs does not take one shape or form. There are a number of different pathways to get to the goal of creating a robust marketplace. Some approaches certainly ring true. Expanding DERS adoption in the first place through providing financial assistance, whether they be subsidies or tax credits, simplifying the enrollment process for VPPs, making it easier for customers to adopt these technologies, taking the steps to standardize the operations of virtual power plants that would fall under the domain of a state regulator. So developing common modeling tools, data sets, et cetera. as I mentioned before, requiring the integration of distributed energy resources into utility IRPs. That is a step that would be appropriate for state regulators, and we're seeing that in other states. And then increasingly important as the FERC rules for the RTOs and ISOs coming out of Order 2222, as those become finalized in the next several years, it's going to be increasingly important that state rules are aligned with those wholesale market rules. So in other words, we don't want to have scenarios where the state rules are inconsistent with what's happening at the wholesale level and create barriers toward achieving those goals. Finally, I would say that there are a number of state opportunities for state regulators. Really, I think that they boil down to taking steps to increase the presence of behind the meter storage on the grid, and particularly taking steps to site these resources in areas that could most benefit from them, whether they be among certain customer classes or in particular regions that are challenged. Also, a policy approach that we have seen is setting mandatory energy storage targets for systems connected to the transmission or the distribution system. Again, developing those financial incentives, whether they be low interest loans, grants, tax credits. And in fact, in a survey that I led earlier this year, the feedback that we heard from developers of energy storage projects is that the number one policy incentive that they found most beneficial coming out of states are the financial incentives that they can pursue in addition to what's available federally. So I really want to emphasize that what we're hearing from developers is that these financial incentives go a long way. But equity, providing financial assistance to disadvantaged customers, helping them increase their own access to these resources, defining compensation mechanisms for DERs. I've already mentioned the IRP role, and also requiring that distributed energy resources are allowed to participate in demand response programs or peak reduction programs. These are all opportunities that a state utility commission could appropriately consider if they want to take very concentrated steps to build out the markets for these aggregated distributed energy resources. So with that, I will close. I want to give thanks to Dr. Zook. As Wayland said, he supports all of the work that we do. And we do continue to track these policy issues within our global energy storage database. It's available publicly to you at that link there. And with that, I will open it up to any questions that have come in.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Will. Great presentation as always.
Thank
Happy
you.
to have you. Looks like I do got one question directly for you. Just a quick note, Chris, I know you posted a question for Waylon in the chat. If we have time, we can circle back to that, or you guys can follow up offline. But Will, a question for you from Brian Evans Mangian of Hyde Park asks, do you consider demand response program efforts to be included in the DER and DER aggregation definitions?
Absolutely, because that's coming out of FERC. FERC has included demand response programs as being within the realm of distributed energy resources. So I defer back to that definition. Now, as we're talking about storage specifically, that definition becomes more granular. So where we're talking typically about behind the meter battery storage systems participating, but demand response programs unquestionably fall within the definition of DERs per FERC.
Great, thank you so much. And looking at the rest of the stuff in the chat, it looks like Charlie and Chris have both just added some comments regarding some of the conversation. Let's see. All right, so I got Vijay Venkayala from the British Columbia Institute of Technology who just posted and asks, IEEE P2030 is expansively looking at the whole scope. However, practical implementations need to share data and experiences. What would be a good way to do this?
Is that a question for me? If it goes back to standards, I would say that it, from a policy perspective, as state regulatory commissions are looking at their legacy interconnection standards, many of which did not address energy storage interconnection, we have a number of states that still need to do that. And so as they embark upon that process, absolutely standards such as IEEE 1547, other standards that are being cited here provide the framework to do that. So it's the good way to do that is for a state not to recreate the wheel, but rather look to what these standards include. And I would say also take steps to have alignment with their neighboring states so that within a region there's consistency. But the good thing is that these standards are available and they're publicly available to regulators. It's a little bit concerning to me that we're not seeing the action across states to take these steps as much as we should be. I don't have specific numbers, but there are still a number of states that have not revised their legacy interconnection standards to address the unique scenarios associated with distributed energy resources, in particular storage.
Great, thank you so much for that. Let's see. All right. Whoa, chat is popping through. Give me 1 second. All right, I got another question from Doug Smith who asks, slide 9 mentions non-wires alternatives requirements in New York. To the extent that DERs like distributed battery storage systems are considered in New York or elsewhere as an alternative to investment in wires, do you know if such systems are allowed to charge or discharge for other purposes at times when the system is not needed for that primary use case in order to achieve market revenues and reduce the net cost of the BESS to customers?
Well, if we're just talking about New York, which I believe we are, that is part of their dual participation policy. So, in other words, when the energy resource that is in question is not being used to support the retail distribution functions, it does have the opportunity to participate in the wholesale transactions. Now, typically it would be the case that the priority is given to supporting the distribution grid and the state's needs. So that would come first. But if there is not a designated need for that, my understanding of the New York policy is that those assets are allowed to participate in wholesale transactions and earn revenue. So that is really the essence of dual participation that's been outlined in New York. I'm not aware of any other state that has defined dual participation as explicitly as New York has.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And let's see, looking at the chat, I think that is it with regards to questions. I know that there's some conversation going on from Charlie, who's helping provide some resources regarding P2030. So thanks for that, Charlie. But looking at time, I think it's okay if we transfer over to Ted Coe from the Energy Policy Design Institute. Ted, are you with us?
Yep, I'm here. I'm gonna see if I can share my slides.
Sure thing, no problem. The floor is yours. Just let me know if you have any issues. I do have your presentation as well if you need me to present on your behalf.
Let's see. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes, we can.
Great. I will put on my camera also so people can see me. See if that's gonna work too. Okay, great. Hello, everybody. Again, my name is Ted Coe, and thank you to the folks here, the organizers and Will, for inviting me to speak with you all today. I am going to speak on regulatory design, and think about how putting on the hat of the regulators of what we would think, how we would plan to design regulations for Vermont for energy storage aggregation specifically. And I can talk more broadly about energy storage in general, but we're focusing for now on energy storage aggregation. So a quick introduction on for myself, only because it's useful because my history is essentially the same as the storage aggregation virtual power plant history, in the sense that I was started working at STEM Inc. in 2015, and STEM was essentially the pioneer in the aggregation of behind the meter energy storage assets into virtual power plants. Pretty much in the country. It's like one of the first companies to actually do this commercially. And so I won't go through every step in this process, but this slide shows a little bit of the timeline of some of the times when we were actually doing this and putting these aggregations up, both mostly in California, but also in New York with the one of the first non-wires alternative programs they had there, and the California demand response auction mechanism. We were one of the first and largest participants in that program that Will also mentioned. With that experience and all that deployment experience, I like to say that we ran into the problems before anybody else, and so that informed our my participation mostly in the different policy making forums around the country and at the ISOs and at FERC on VPPs, especially specifically storage based VPPs. And then so I've pretty much seen there, been there, done that. So just for everyone's sake, as like any topic about storage deployment, VPPs, and aggregation and participation in markets, I've probably spent some time debating it over the last bunch of years. So, and that all culminated pretty much in pretty heavy involvement with FERC directly on the development of Order 2222 and how that came out. And I'll reference that later as we talk about the different policies and the different aspects of that policy. Just a brief thing about the Energy Policy Design Institute. We're a very new organization, but to be clear, we are not an advocacy organization. We are a neutral organization that is dedicated to facilitating the faster, better development of regulations and policies and programs. And so our idea is like we're not a research institution, and I put here just a contrast of an organization with a similar name that you're all familiar with, EPRI, which conducts a lot of research that helps inform policymaking. Whereas EPDI actually doesn't conduct research; it uses its experience and deep experience and like hands-on experience with policymaking to create tools to help people design policies in going forward. And so our approach is to create these tools and then deliver them and help mostly state commissions use these tools in a proceeding just like the one we're talking about today. And so the just to give you an idea of the approach, some of the tools that we create include a shared dictionary of terminology on the topic area. It includes vision statements and objectives for policy design, and as well as a bunch of kind of fundamental design principles that are specific to a particular topic like energy storage or VPPs that can be used to build policies and programs on top of. And I highlighted those in green because those are the ones I'm going to talk about today. The other kinds of things that we do are other things that we're helping, like, for example, the Maryland Energy Storage Program with. But I'm not going to have time to talk about it today. I don't think we're going to have enough time to do that. So we're applying this approach right now to the Energy Storage Program Working Group. And today I will be talking about how we bring that to this topic of conversation, which is VPPs and storage aggregation. So talking about terminology first. The first step is always talk about terminology in a shared dictionary. So what is storage aggregation? And so I wanted to highlight this because it's actually the way we use it, storage aggregation and VPPs and define VPPs in policy for EPDI is actually different than what you just heard from the DOE liftoff report and Will's presentation. It's a different, it's not to say one is right or wrong. It's more just to say what is, like, we're interested in what's effective and what's useful, a useful definition in terms of scoping your design work for your policy and your regulations. So in our definition here, the key distinction is that the aggregation of resources is participating in markets and providing services as a single resource. And so that all the resources that in your VPP are acting in a coordinated fashion rather than a portfolio of assets, which are all responding individually to a market signal or a dispatch signal or something like that, right? So to be clear, like, so that's the distinction we're making, and so it's actually an important distinction when it comes to making policy. And so, like the retail model that Will mentioned from the liftoff report and the utility models are both examples of actually sometimes they can be and sometimes they aren't. And the key question is whether or not the resources are acting in concert and looking to the grid operator, the grid, as a single resource, or they're looking at it as a bunch of a collection of individual resources. And so to use some of the examples that were in the previous presentation, the state of California, for example, the DRAM program is a VPP program where participants in the DRAM program do create VPPs to participate in that program. But the ELRP is not, where the ELRP is a market signal that's put out to individual resources, and each individual resource can decide how it reacts to that market signal. So it's not in our definition, it's not a VPP. Something a little closer to Vermont, in the Massachusetts case, you look at the Sunrun's aggregation of resources in ISO New England's DR, which is a VPP because it's, again, a coordinated response to a market dispatch. Whereas the Connected Solutions program in Massachusetts is not, because again, it's individual resources can respond to the Connected Solutions dispatch from the utility, but is not participating as a aggregated set of resources. So that's a way, just a way of making that distinction. And to the question that was in the chat before, demand response programs can be either, right? So a demand response program is like your traditional demand response where you're getting a signal from the utility and each site decides how it wants to respond to it, is not a VPP. But like I said, in the demand response auction mechanism in California, that is, you have a national contract as a single resource for an X number of megawatts to respond to the utility. And that is a VPP. So just want to go through that just to make it clear, so that as we go through the discussion or in this presentation, it'll be more clear about why that distinction actually is useful and matters. So going again, what we always ask is, again, why are we talking about this, or why do we care about these things first? And I know there have been several workshops on storage already, but it's important to understand about the distinction between why storage and why VPPs. And so just at a high level, states typically cite the idea of, like, why do we want storage is more for these three main types of drivers for need. But and that's just, it's a good reference point to keep in mind as we think about why VPPs and whether or not they can provide these things that we're looking for to get from storage. So then we go into why VPPs is, like, up to this point, I mean, before the rise of VPPs of the last 5 or 6 years, most people thought of storage as you're getting services from storage as a single asset, like one resource equals one asset equals one resource. But one of the benefits of aggregation is, why do you turn multiple assets into one actual resource, is for one of these three main reasons typically. So one of it is scale. So it's the idea of, like, you can get for a service that can only really be provided at decent scale, the smaller resources would typically not be able to provide that service. Say, like, participating in a wholesale market where the minimum size is like a megawatt. But if you aggregate them, then you can then participate and provide that service from these smaller resources and get maximum value from them. The second one is resource reliability. The idea of like just in general, a resource that's made up of a bunch of multiple assets is going to be a little bit more or considerably more reliable than a single asset, which is a single point of failure. So just in general, as a resource, that kind of resource diversity gives you more reliability. And then the last part is flexibility, is the idea that what's available to the grid from a resource could be is kind of limited if it's a single resource. And this idea that it's like you can only get it from that resource and that time and its timing and its state of charge and its availability determines what you're able to do with that resource, providing that resource. Whereas again, if you have a multiple set of resources, you can optimize the response or the service you're providing based on pulling from different resources at different times, and the capacity or the state of charge that's available in a whole fleet of batteries rather than just one single asset. So this is the benefits of VPPs, and it's useful in terms of understanding why we would want to enable them and promote them on the system, because they provide these benefits. But so relating it back to the why storage ideas is that VPPs again can help with renewables integration and grid reliability, the same as a single asset. VPPs can help with grid modernization and capacity growth, the same as a single asset. But if we're thinking about resilience, typically a VPP isn't providing resilience as a single resource the way that its individual resources would do it. So typically, you're not looking for a VPP to provide resilience or backup power in an outage the way you would be relying on a single resource to provide backup power in an outage. And that's just kind of typical, right? So it's important to understand the idea of what you're looking to get from storage versus what you're looking to get from VPPs, and why you would incentivize and promote the formation of VPPs in your system. Okay, I'm moving through this relatively quickly. I'm sorry, but there's not a whole lot of time. So one of the first questions people ask when they're talking about VPPs in their system is, what services do you want? Like, what do you want VPPs for? And I think Will's presentation had a list from the DOE liftoff report about a bunch of the values and things about VPPs. And what I want to do is make this distinction here, is like what I made in the beginning is like there's a difference between, there's a lot of things here that are about VPPs and a lot of things that were in that report that are about DERs and storage itself, not specific to VPPs. And so I'm going to make the distinction here that we're talking about things that are like specific to VPPs and not just DERs and storage in general. So the answer to this question is that it's actually a trick question. It's actually not that you want to, as a regulator, as a policymaker, think about or predetermine the kinds of services that you want to get from VPPs, because the VPP is essentially acting like a power plant or a storage asset, right? So the idea is you treat the VPPs the same way, enable those assets to provide those services, and VPPs will then be able to also do that. So the idea is that you don't make policy and design programs specifically for VPPs. This coming from a person who's like had a pretty extensive career in promoting VPPs and wanting them to happen. The idea from a policy point of view is that you don't actually specifically design for VPPs. You design for the services and things that you want to get from these like storage assets, and then make sure that VPPs can participate and provide those services, and then compete on a level playing field. So you do need to make sure that your programs and your policies remove any barriers that are unique to VPPs, and make sure that VPPs are eligible for everything that you've created in terms of services and programs and incentives. But again, you don't make it directly about VPPs. One of the examples of this is the idea of RFPs for energy storage that they might put out, like for example in California, when to reach their energy storage target. You put out a utility RFP to do that, to say, okay, we want to get X megawatts of energy storage. But one of the conditions of the RFP was that any bidder that was going to bid a project into the RFP had to have a interconnection agreement already before they could bid, before they could submit an application or a bid. So this is for single assets. That's not an uncommon or unreasonable requirement, but it then actually took out VPPs and was a barrier to VPPs actually bidding in. Where a VPP provider would say, I'm going to bid in a 10 megawatt asset, a resource, right? That's going to consist of 20, 50, 100 actual physical assets, none of which I actually have done interconnection for yet, because I won't do that until I get the contract. So that's just an example of the idea of, you have to make sure your regulatory mechanism, your programs, enable and allow VPPs to participate in everything that single assets can participate in. One of the next questions that a lot of people ask is, what locations and configurations of VPPs do we want on our system? Like, where do we want VPPs? And what kind of configurations, solar and storage? Does it mix storage with other kinds of technologies? Do you want an aggregation of electric school buses that are idle over the summer? All these kinds of questions are what a lot of people want to ask at the start of designing an energy storage program, or a VP or energy storage program for their state. Again, I'm going to say that this is again also a trick question. Is again, like where and how VPPs are formed is not something that needs to be or should be actually predetermined by the regulators, or by the market, or by even by the utilities. The idea is that you use your mechanisms, either your grid services or your programs or your procurements, to use pricing to express the value of the services that these assets or these resources are going to provide, and then it actually points people to the locations where you want these services. And so the idea is more of it. I put it on there. It's kind of a joke, but it's like, if you pay for it, they will come, right? It's not yeah, here's, build it here. And I'm telling you to build it here. It's where it's going to be more valuable, and is going to attract the actual development of these things. And again, mechanisms and regulations should not specify configurations. Also, it's like doesn't have to be solar and storage. It doesn't have to be EV, like V2G EVs. It's you put out the mechanisms and the procurements to get the resources that you want, and then it's up to the developers, the people who do that, to configure it in the way that works and that makes sense. So this is kind of one of the top principles of any policy related to VPPs, is what I call abstraction. Is like, you don't look behind the curtain. The whole point of a VPP is that it looks to you, the grid operator, or the procurement entity, or the buyer, or whatever, like a single asset. It looks like a single virtual power plant, and a single power plant. And unless you absolutely have to, it's the rules and policies and programs do not look behind the curtain and see how it was done. Except for again, there are some reasons and absolute necessities why you would want to do that, but in the vast majority of cases, it's not necessary, and it's actually counterproductive in a lot of cases to actually try to look behind the curtain. So I'm going to go into, I know I'm going long on time here, but I'm just going to go into some idea about the principles. And then again, this is what we talk about at EPTI, is like, we're not here to tell you what to do. we're here to tell you what kind of principles and design ideas and foundational ideas to build your policies and programs on top of. And it's not based on, again, our advocacy for a position or about any of these. This is based on what we've seen has worked, and experience has worked, and it doesn't work for policy design in this space, specifically in energy storage and VPPs. And so I'm not going to go through all these super quickly, but again, some of the things that I've alluded to before is something like full participation, which is again anything that at a single resource, a single site or single site resource can do and can be paid for and can provide should be open and available to VPPs also. And this is again, and then you want to allow fair competition between single site resources and VPPs in all these mechanisms too. And I put a star on there just to show that these are the kinds of things that we've established as principles in the Maryland Working Group for their storage program design. One of the other things is that multi-use. This was actually mentioned in the comment in the chat before. Is like to whatever extent possible, as much as possible, multi-use of DERs and the assets in the VPPs should be enabled and allowed and promoted. Again, that's to make the VPPs more effective and cost effective, but it just makes everything more cost effective, and it makes you able to provide the services from storage and VPPs at a lower price to ratepayers. And again, this is a I note that was a very specific policy win that we had in fourth quarter 22 was to do that, to make sure you do that, which was very different than their initial proposal for that order, which was going to be extremely restrictive on multi-use and dual participation, and in the initial proposal, and we had to fight very strongly to make sure that that was reversed in the final rule. And then I'll go into some other ones that are specific to wholesale retail VPPs. Again, this is again related specifically to Order 2222, and it was a lot of the things that we actually fought about in that rule to make sure that VPPs are, the rules are right and correct and effective for VPPs. One of the big debates and questions, and this is very relevant to the distribution utilities and the state level regulators of distribution utilities, is this idea of provable risk. Is like the idea that you can't restrict, you shouldn't restrict the operations and participation of VPPs and the assets, the DERs inside the VPPs, without proving that there's a real risk involved in allowing that participation. And this was in response to the idea that the initial FERC order proposed rules were pretty much allowed a distribution utility to veto any DER from joining a VPP without any justification. It was pretty much just a kind of a blanket veto. And that was not good, to put it bluntly. And so we argued about that, and we had to push that to make sure that that kind of blanket veto was taken out of the final order. And then one of the other ones here that I'll mention is reasonable overhead. The idea that the overhead or the participation overhead that you impose on DERs, individual DERs in a VPP, cannot be so burdensome that it doesn't make sense for them to even participate in the VPP. And so this came around. This was really around like metering and telemetry that the ISOs and RTOs wanted to impose on the individual DER assets within a VPP that were just way too expensive for it to make sense. So we got a bit of a win on that too in that sense in the order also. But again, these are just more examples of the kinds of principles and ideas that would underlie the development of any rules and regulations and programs around storage and VPPs specifically. Um, so I know I went pretty long there, so I'm going to just go through and just say that was my last slide. Thank you for the opportunity, and I'm definitely excited to answer any questions.
All right, great. Yeah, thank you so much, Ted. Really appreciate the time and everything today, and great presentation. Looks like as some questions start to filter in, I do got a two-parter from Charlie Vartanian from IEEE. Firstly, he asks, is STEM or others, including V1G smart charging and / or V2G grid interactive, EVs in VPP plans or projects?
So I can't talk to STEM because I haven't worked there for a couple of years, but in general, yes. I think there are definitely companies that have been formed around V2G and V1G. So V1G in most cases, for most people falls under demand response, and so will like they can participate like we did with the early days of storage. When storage was not exporting beyond the meter, we just participated in the demand response markets and did that. V2G, where you would think about exporting energy back to the grid, um, needs to use the other kinds of constructs um, like the CalISO DERP as an example. And yes, there are people who've been working on that for quite a while. And they have gotten some wins on that in terms of like interconnection and sub metering and stuff like that, which are all the kinds of issues that you need to solve um, to enable behind the meter VPPs, which is not unique to EVs, but is kind of like true across the board.
Great, thank you so much. And part two of his question is, does EV topic add motivation to policymakers relative to engaging the VPP topic, even though aspect specific interest does not open the curtain a bit?
Yes. So yes and no. So there's been a lot of studies and analysis written out there about the potential benefits of grid services and the potential capacity and grid services that can be provided by all the EVs that are out there plugging into the grid. And so that is a motivation for um, doing what you can to enable them to do that, to join VPPs. Um, not because it's not specifically that EVs, but just in general, those kinds of resources can provide that. And so that the potential there for the benefit to the grid is significant, right? Enough for people to do that. I have my own opinions about whether whether that potential is really as big as it's claimed to be. So that's another conversation. But to date, yes, the potential has been shown to be an important motivating factor for getting these policies right.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see. Looking in the chat, I don't see any other questions that have come in, so I will ask a question in the hopes that maybe there's going to be some more. Just from someone who is super new to all of this and doesn't have a lot of technical background or anything in this area, from your perspective, what is your biggest lessons learned when working with VPPs and aggregation as a whole?
I think the biggest lessons learned are mm, the challenge is pretty much an education one. Is like the idea. I mean, the concept generally makes sense to people,
Mhm.
but the translation of that into the appropriate policies that are needed to make these things happen. I mean, the technology is already there, and so the challenge is that people think that this is like some amazing new thing that's super complicated, and then we have to pilot and test out. But I mean, we've been doing it for at least 9 years now, and at scale, at reasonable scale, not huge scale, and and we know that the technology works, the software works, and that we just need to get all those other barriers down. Like a lot of the things that Will talked about like interconnection and other things like that, like the barriers to DRs in general. But it's more, a lot of the times it's more about that than it is about VPP specifically.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much. Super, super interesting stuff. And I'm happy to learn more about it. Charlie, yeah, we got time for another question.
Yeah.
He asks, are there global models for VPP market or policy structures you recommend looking at?
I'm not familiar with many of the international models. The key one is, the key example that I've heard about is how they do it in Australia, which seems to be like the most progress in actually doing this for participation in their markets. But the policy structures are really more around the, like, actually I should use this example, question to go back to something that Will said actually about the Cal ISO and the VPPs. Is like, it's a good example of a market that has created the rules that adhere to the letter of the order, but in practical terms doesn't actually work. And so you'll find that the Cal ISO is what they call their DIRT model, which has been actually in place for a long time before Order 2222. One of the reasons we were working with them on Cal ISO on that was that it wasn't working and nobody was participating, and it actually existed, right? The order comes out, the Cal ISO's response was, we have this already. We don't need to do anything more, or very little more, to comply with the order. But they didn't acknowledge at all that it just wasn't working. Like nobody was actually participating in it because it had several design challenges and problems with it that made it very hard to actually do. So so I think it's important to look at the models, and like I don't think any of the ISOs have an implementation that's really great yet. I think New York may be coming closest in their implementation, but yeah, we don't otherwise have really good models or structures that have proven to be great so far.
All right. Thank you so much, Ted. Looks like that's all the questions I have for you in the chat. Another round of applause for you. Thank you so much for joining our webinar and really enlightening us to what's going on here in this subject area. So appreciate it. Thank you so much. Looking at the time. Oh, we got a hand up. David Cressy. Do you have a question?
So,
Yeah.
yeah. Sorry, I was trying to type in the chat and it wasn't really working. Thanks a lot for this. This has been just awesome. I'm up in Vermont, working under Burlington Electric Department, and I just wanted to throw out a oversimplified sum up and see if you thought it was accurate, because I am seeing an overlapping theme here of the more money and freedom you give the market, the better. If you have a robust fire and safety standard. Is that kind of the theme that you're seeing emerge in states?
Yeah, I wouldn't. Yes, yeah. I mean, yes, in general, and I think in terms of as a organizing principle for storage in general, as a policy in terms of when a state is looking at how do we develop our storage market in our state to get to the deployment of storage that we think we need in the future. The idea is to say, not to throw money at it, but to say, let us make sure that we've put up all the mechanisms that compensate storage for the value it can provide. So all the many different things that storage can do, of all the many things it can do, in most states, it's only a pretty small subset that they can get paid for, right? So the idea is to create the market to pay the storage for all the services it can provide, um, fair, full market value type payments, right? And then have your fire and safety standards and your interconnection processes in place, and then that's how you get the deployment of storage in your system, and to where and how much you need is to do it that way. And that's what we call designing an energy storage roadmap. It's like the roadmap is that. The roadmap is how and when are you going to put up those mechanisms to compensate storage.
Thanks, Ted. Well said.
All right. And just looking at the interest of time, we are at that point where we can begin closing out. I do see that Dr. Zook is on the line. Dr. Zook, if you wanted to go ahead and give us some closing comments before I hand it over to John, I think we would all appreciate that if you want.
Yeah, I do. It's a pleasure to be setting up these webinars for Vermont, where we have an active and willing to innovate Public Utility Commission. And we are, of course, willing to give it the best of our experience and of our acquaintance with various speakers, and make it a viable set of webinars. Assets are, of course, very important asset, putting them together. In the early days, we thought of something called community storage, and that's essentially where all of this grew out of, even though community storage was too small and it didn't really work as such. But when you aggregate it into a larger unit, I think it could be a very powerful tool. So thanks for all these talks. Ted Coe and Will McNamara and Wayland Clark. Wayland Clark, of course, has presented a lot of projects that we did with, particularly with a view of bringing energy storage into some communities that would otherwise not have access to it. This is very important, but it's also relatively new. So once more, thanks to Vermont for listening, and thanks to all the speakers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for being such a driving force in energy storage. So we appreciate you greatly. All right, John, I'm going to pass it over. Oh, Will, did you have a comment, Will?
Yes, as John and I had discussed, we thought it would be appropriate to give a preview of next week. So John, if you'd like me to do that.
Yeah, I mean, we have about 10 minutes or so left. So if you can do it in that period of time, yeah, I think that would be very helpful. So
Sure. Just
Will.
actually fairly briefly, but we are excited about next week, which will be the fifth and final session in this series. It's going to take a little bit of a different format than we've been following up to this point. We are going to focus on state regulatory best practices within New England. And so we're going to do this as more of a roundtable discussion rather than just presentations. And I think that we have an excellent opportunity to really involve a lot of audience participation. As John mentioned, we have made the call for questions. And so I would strongly encourage you to submit those. The states that we have on board to participate next week are Connecticut, Maine, and Massachusetts. And we're still hopeful that we will have a representative from Rhode Island also in participation. So, as I hope you can see, as we've up to this point talked very broadly about issues, we've talked about technology, about economics, policy, etc. We're going to end with a discussion that is very regional and close to home. And so as Vermont continues to explore its opportunities for policymaking, I think it will be very informative to have this discussion with the neighboring states and what has worked for them and the lessons that can be learned. So next week, each of these states will provide a very high-level 10-minute presentation of their experience to date with energy storage policymaking, and then the duration of the session will be a roundtable discussion. So please get those questions submitted, and we'll look forward to ending on a very exciting note next week. That's what I had, John. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Will. Yeah, and I would encourage folks. I know the order we set out, that close of business tomorrow was the deadline for questions. If you come up with questions after that, please feel free to go ahead and file them in EPUC. The idea is to get them to the roundtable participants in advance so they can give them consideration and address them more fully. But obviously, if you have a question that comes up between now and the roundtable, please file it. And obviously, again, during the roundtable, the chat will be open for people to ask questions or ask them to address particular topics. So I personally, I wanted to thank everybody, all the presenters today. And again, Dylan, I think just does an incredible job managing the platform for us. I personally found today to be incredibly informative, and I'm expecting next week to be very informative as well and very helpful in our efforts to move forward with a rulemaking. So with that, we conclude session number 4 in our series. The 5th session will be next Thursday, December 7th, 2023, again from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. I won't go into a description of it because you've all just heard that already. So I think with that, we will call it a day. Thank everyone for attending, and we hope that all of you can come back again next week for the final session. Thank you very much. We're concluded.